I'm Holly. I am the new Smoke Science Program Director at Tall Timbers. The Smoke Science Program is brand new. So today I'm going to be talking about just some smoke management considerations. So I promise I'm not going to bore you with too many details about the smoke management itself, but I just wanted to get everybody on the same page. What are the goals of smoke management? And those can really come down to a few words, particularly three. You want avoidance, minimization, and dilution. So you want to obviously try to minimize the amount of smoke you produce from what you're burning. And you really want to avoid hitting smoke into those high population centers, those smoke sensitive areas such as schools, nursing homes, hospitals. You really don't want to hit roadways during rush hour or fog events. You create, those of us who've been in Florida a while, we've heard the super fog events that happen in Central Florida. So basically you really want meteorology to work with you and not against you. So this is just a figure from some smoke modeling. You kind of want that panel on the top where your smoke is being lifted up and away from where you're burning, so you can burn near cities and everything like that, with the ultimate goal of eventually your smoke will come down somewhere. So you want to have time to mix with in the atmosphere with some other air and become really dilute and diffuse by the time it hits somewhere where it might have an impact. But nothing's perfect, and so sometimes there is a probability that it can stay on the ground, and that might be okay for where you burn, because maybe you're in a rural area, maybe you're in a forest, and it's going to have enough time to get dilute so that by the time it hits the cities or a population area, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Well, I recognize we've got a lot of experienced burners in this room, so I don't want to spend the next 35 minutes talking about what transport wind speeds you might like to see or what relative humidities, because you all know your areas. Or for those of you that don't, I'm not going to be able to cram all that information into 35 minutes. So I want to direct everybody to this new course that's free that Tall Timbers has created called Be Smoke Savvy, and it's worth 2 Category 1 continuing education credits. And it's about 2 hours or so, and it teaches you all about the best smoke management practices. So I'll leave that up here for a few seconds, or you can just Google Be Smoke Savvy Tall Timbers and it pops up, and that is open through December 20th. So what I wanted to focus my talk on here today more is why should we care and practice these best management practices so much? So in particular, I'm sure some of you have probably heard the Environmental Protection Agency has some new air quality regulations, and there is concern with prescribed fire and how that's going to be impacted in light of these new regulations. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about the bulk of my presentation today. And what are some things we can do to help manage any of those impacts that might happen from prescribed fire that might run into this new EPA guidelines? And then what are some tools that a burn manager or a burn practitioner can use to help take some of this stuff into consideration and plan their burns better? So taking kind of a wide level approach again, stepping back, what is smoke? What is in smoke exactly? So there's several different compounds that are in smoke. There's a large amount of water vapors, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hot air and gases, and the amount of gases and concentrations really depend on what kind of fuel you're burning. But what I really want to focus on, because that's what the EPA is currently focusing on, is this PM and PM 2.5. So if you're not familiar with it, you might be wondering, well, what exactly is PM 2.5? And those of you that have heard about it before, I'm sure you've seen this picture a lot. But PM stands for particulate matter, and PM 2.5 specifically is particulate matter that's 2.5 microns or less in diameter. So how small is that? Well, it is really, really small. So for example, if we take another step back and look at PM10, or that's particulate matter that's 10 microns or more in diameter, and laid against here is the cross-section of a human hair, you can fit 5 PM10 molecules side by side across the width of a human hair. So PM10 is small enough where it can bypass the nose and the throat, which is your body's first line of defense, fighting against the different things that try to invade it and make it sick. And it can move into the lungs. So it kind of settles into that area in your chest, and it can cause some throat irritation, some minor coughing. But a bigger concern is PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 is even smaller. You can fit 4 PM 2.5 molecules across the width of a PM 10 molecule. So 20 can fit across the width of a human hair. And because they're so small, they can penetrate deeper into the lungs and they start getting into vessels that interact with your bloodstream. So you start having these PM 2.5 molecules circulating in your bloodstream. So what can that do to you? Well, there's been a whole litany of studies, and it's been linked to everything from cardiovascular disease, increasing heart attack risk, exacerbating asthma symptoms and COPD symptoms, even leading to lung cancer. There's been some studies showing that it can increase the risk for Alzheimer's the more you're exposed to PM 2.5. And I just read a study a couple weeks ago that came out that said male fertility can be impacted by PM 2.5. Female fertility shows a little bit less of an impact from it, and just lead to premature mortality. So that's really what put it on the radar of the Environmental Protection Agency, because it's been linked to all these bad things. Well, PM 2.5, what is it exactly? It can have different components to it. It could be biological or a natural component. It could be inorganic or an organic component. There's several different sources from it. Sea salt, for example, is a source. So when you go to the beach and you breathe in that lovely smell, you're getting PM 2.5 from the sea salt sometimes. And then anthropogenic sources are a big one, particularly vehicular exhaust and industry burning coal that can produce a lot of PM 2.5. And then of course there's natural sources of volcanic emissions, but in particular, and why I'm talking about it today, wildfire and prescribed fire can also produce PM 2.5. So as I was talking about all these health impacts, of course, the Environmental Protection Agency, they're tasked with protecting the population and keeping our environment and human health as healthy as they can. So they have the Clean Air Act, which was last amended in 1990, and it's really focused on maintaining low levels of these 6 principal pollutants. So particulate matter is one of them. They also have ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and lead. And so here's a figure showing how these levels of these different pollutants have changed since 1990, since they had the amended Clean Air Act, and they have all decreased about 50%. And so in particular, what I'm going to be talking about today is PM 2.5. And if you can read it, you may notice there's 2 different levels. So they have different concentrations or acceptable threshold levels for both PM 2.5, a daily average, and then a yearly average, which takes 3 years together to come up with the yearly average. And what they recently just changed was the annual or yearly concentration of PM 2.5 that they deem acceptable. So what did they do? Well, before it was 12 micrograms per meter cubed, which means that if you take a meter cubed of air and you shake all out the PM 2.5, you're going to end up with 12 micrograms previously, which is a very small amount. But now they've lowered it to 9. So right here, this is from 2010 to 2023. This is taking all the southeastern EPA monitoring sites. So there's 85 in this particular calculation. The previous standard right here is this dashed gray line, which is at 12 micrograms per meter cubed. And so we were safely below that. And then now they've lowered it to 9 micrograms per meter cubed. That took effect the beginning of this year, but they're giving some states some time to come up with their areas of concern. But so now you can see that we're much closer to that national standard. And I get a question a lot, can it lower even more? And that's possible. It can lower even more. The World Health Organization recommends a level no higher than 5 micrograms per meter cubed for human health. So that's would definitely put a lot, that would be down here. But right now it's just 9 micrograms. And they have tasked each state, they must designate areas according to the EPA monitoring stations that are going to be out of attainment or above that level. And the states have until early next year, 2025, to turn that information over to the EPA. And then the EPA makes their final decision of whether or not an area is out of attainment by early 2026. So what's the big deal if you're out of attainment? Well, not attainment areas are going to have further regulation. And so that's going to mainly be on industry or point sources. So they're going to have to adopt the best technology to try and limit the amount of emissions they have. They're going to have to prove it to the county, and they're going to have to prove it to the state and the government that they are doing the best they can to manage this. And there is a concern that it might impact prescribed fire usage. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, because right now, this is not the official designation yet. The EPA, before they came out with this ruling, they went ahead and did a trial and said, okay, if we look at some historic data, what counties are going to be out of attainment if we take it down to 10 micrograms or 9 micrograms per meter cubed? So in Florida, there's only 2 counties that they identified. And like I said, this has not been finalized yet by the state of Florida or the Florida DEP. But it's Escambia and Broward County. And, you know, Florida, we overall have pretty good air quality. So we really benefit from being a peninsula, which I was just talking with Andy is great for smoke, but not so great for hurricanes. But another concern, especially in North Florida, is that our smoke has to go somewhere. And some of it is going to Georgia. And so Georgia has a larger problem. And I'm going to be talking more in depth about Georgia because Tall Timbers, we've been working really closely with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division and the Georgia Forestry Commission because they are very concerned about balancing prescribed fire usage with air quality and keeping those both intact. And so we've been working on some case studies with them. But I promise I'm bringing it back to Florida because right now what's going on in Georgia is really being looked at the EPA at the national level, and it could be something we might see extend into Florida if certain areas become out of attainment more than that figure shows. So I got this figure. This is looking at Georgia, and this is from Georgia EPD, Jim Boylan up there. And so you may see it looks a lot different from this previous figure. There's a lot more areas that are highlighted here. Those red areas are out of attainment, and those yellow areas are right at the cusp, and they may or may not fall out of attainment, meaning they exceed that 9 microgram per meter cubed average, and the green areas are pretty well under it, so there's not a concern. And the reason why there's so many more counties highlighted here than the previous slide is part of the ruling is as well that any counties that contribute to a sensor being out of attainment are also going to be classified as not in attainment. So this is why all these counties around Atlanta are now classified as being a non-attainment. And so they're subject to further regulation. And so that you can see almost the entire state of Georgia is now might be considered out of attainment. So you may be thinking, well, that's not entirely fair. Like, what if something contributes to it? Like, if you remember last year, we had Canadian wildfire smoke that came all the way here. Like, how can we help that? Or prescribed fire has been recognized as being beneficial, and even the EPA recognizes it as being beneficial. And it's included, for example, in the Georgia State Wildlife Action Plan as a necessary tool. So why is it a negative? We know it's a positive. The EPA does have something called an exceptional event, which is an unusual or naturally occurring event that you can say with the Canadian wildfire smoke, hey, this came from Canada. We can't control Canada. It's not our fault that it happened. And you file some paperwork and they say, okay, well, it's not going to count against you. We say it's an exceptional event. So we're going to take that out of your average and we're going to calculate a new average, and you may or may not be in attainment. The EPA says, okay, we can do the same thing with prescribed fire. We'll allow it to be an exceptional event, and that data will be excluded from that annual average. So that sounds great for those counties, particularly in South Georgia, that are mainly impacted with smoke. And so it would really help them, but it's a lot more complicated than they make it out to be, because exceptional event documentation is expensive and time-consuming, extensive. It takes about 60 to 70 pages per exceptional event. And so each prescribed fire would be considered its own exceptional event. So, for example, talking with Jim Boylan, looking at Georgia to get every one of those airsheds I just showed into compliance, they estimate for the past 2 years, they're going to have 220 exceptional events. So each one of those having 60 to 70 pages, they estimate they're going to need to hire 2 to 3 new people full-time just to work on writing exceptional events. Because like I said, currently each prescribed fire has to be its own. So they are working with, and other state organizations are working with the Environmental Protection Agency to try and make this not so burdensome and try to see if they can do something better than every single fire has to be an exceptional event. But I think most consensus would be, it would probably be better if we can regulate ourselves or regulate at the state level before we have federal regulations come in. So what can we do? And so right now, Like I said, I'm going to be jumping into Georgia because I think it's interesting to everybody in this room. We at Tall Timbers and Georgia Forestry Commission have been working together in Albany, Georgia, to create a pilot program for the Georgia Forestry Commission on how can we best balance keeping that airshed as clean as possible, but also allow enough prescribed fire to happen to meet everybody's objectives. So looking specifically at the city of Albany, Georgia. So right here, that red star, that is where the EPA monitoring station is located. We are creating the pilot 2.0. So the last year, the previous through February and April of this year, there was a pilot project. There was one last year too, and it was good enough to keep smoke out of the airshed on the worst days, but it still put us right at that 3-year average of 9.0 micrograms per meter cubed, literally no breathing room in it. We're right at that standard. So we wanted to make it even lower. So we're more comfortable in there and we've got room for growth and development. So first we came up with this 30-mile perimeter. So that's that red circle. So if you're within 30 miles of Albany, you're going to face additional restrictions versus if you're outside of this circle. So you may also notice that there is kind of this blue pie slice that's coming out of it. That if you're within that blue cone, you're going to face even more restrictions or just more hoops to jump through to get a burn permit. And so this is not fixed in this direction. This blue pie slice is actually based on the transport wind direction. So basically, if you're burning where your smoke is going to move over that sensor or that population area of Albany, you're going to have to go through some more criteria before you can get a big burn permit to prove that you're not going to pollute the airshed too much. So this is what we came up with. So I'll kind of walk you through it generally, but if you're within this 30-mile radius right here, this 30-mile buffer, if your transport winds are low, 5 miles per hour or less, your dispersion's already low, you're not going to get to burn. So if you're already doing best management practices for smoke, you're probably not going to want to burn on those days anyway. The next one is that if your transport wind speed's a little bit higher, or actually, sorry, right at 5 miles per hour or less still, but your dispersion's a lot better, you can burn up to 25 acres of silviculture. So the idea is that you're letting the smaller landowners burn, the big land burning's not happening yet, so that you can get those small land burns out of the way. So on days where it's really great air quality, the big burners can burn and hopefully not pollute the airshed so much. And then finally, if you're just in this red area, if your transport wind speeds are great, your dispersion's good, burning's gonna be permitted as normal, depending on what the GFC criteria is for burning in that region. But if you are inside this cone, you need to have, if your transport wind speeds are less, if you're already polluted in your airshed because there's already a lot of PM 2.5 in the area, or if smoke dispersion is bad, there's not going to be any permitted burns. And then it goes on from there. So if your transport wind speeds pick up, your dispersion's okay, then you can burn that 25 acres again, letting the smaller landowners burn, but they want all firing operations done by 2 p.m. So the idea is that it will have time to move out of the population area of Albany before nighttime settles and that boundary layer comes down and traps smoke at the surface, because a lot of these exceedances are happening overnight. And then finally, if you've got great transport wind speeds, great dispersion, depending on how great your dispersion is, you can either burn up to 100 acres or 250 acres. And the next question might be, when is this taking place? So this is starting January 1st, and they're actually going to run it through the whole calendar year. So they're just not going to do it in burn season. They want to see, keeping this in place, how much burning they can still get done compared to a normal year's burning, how well the airshed's going to hold up and get below that threshold. And of course, the next logical question might be, okay, well, how badly is this going to impact burning? Are now I'm only going to have 5 good burn days? So I went ahead and looked at the meteorology for this particular, assuming the transport winds coming from the southwest. This is one of the most impacted areas as far as you've got a lot of transport wind. February through February through April. That comes from the south, southwest. So we've got a lot of heavy burners in here too. And it doesn't impact it a whole lot. There are some. So basically, I guess on this screen, if it's white, it's unrestricted. Black are just bad burn days to begin with. Nobody's really burning. It's usually when rain's happening, cold fronts coming through, GFC's restricting for other reasons that have nothing to do with the location of Albany. Like I said, it's usually a frontal passage. And then there's really only a couple of weeks of days that are impacted, but you still have burning permitted on most days. There is only one day, if you look at 2023, if you apply those same rules, where burning would not have been able to take place if you were inside that blue cone. So there'll still be plenty of burning opportunities. And again, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it here was to keep in mind that they're also getting smoke from us. So this is a high split model run, which just does some back trajectory, basically saying, okay, well, the smoke, we know there was a bad exceedance day, one at this day in February of 2023. Where was that smoke coming from? Where was it 12 hours before it hit the sensor, or 24 hours? And the 12 hours before it hit the sensor is actually coming up through Florida, where a lot of heavy burning was happening. It also moved through Albany, where some burning was happening. So it's picking up smoke along the way. So I'm just kind of telling this to everybody, just to be mindful of your smoke and say, oh, well, if I have a couple of good burn days coming up and one's going to blow it directly into Georgia, but the other one's going to blow it out to the ocean, maybe choose blowing out to the ocean instead. So now a question might be, well, this is all a bunch of information that's just been dumped on me. Like, how can I manage my smoke here in Florida, or just in general, what are some tools I can look at? Well, I'm going to talk about some tools for smoke management. And, we were already discussing some of those earlier with Andy was discussing some, but there's also some National Weather Service sites, the Fire Weather Dashboard and the Fire Weather Forecasts. So the Fire Weather Dashboard is here. And the reason why I am pointing this out particularly is because this is what GFC is going to use for the Albany area. So the criteria on whether or not you get a permit based on transport wind speed and direction is coming from this website, and they're looking at the 2 p.m. forecast. So that's something you can look at as well if you're interested in the transport wind speed or direction. You can also go to your local National Weather Service site. So this is a kind of a more general smoke forecast or fire weather forecast you can look at. And if you're a more visual person, and I know I'm going through these kind of fast, so if you want any information about these, feel free to email me. I'll have my contact information at the end. At Tall Timbers, at our GIS department, they've worked with Georgia Department of Natural Resources and created the Smoke Conditions in the Southeast web mapping application, but it's not just for Georgia, so anybody can access it. And what's really nice about it is that you've got a bunch of different layers you can turn on. I could send you a tutorial if you're interested in it. You can have current and forecast. So this is actually a forecast map. So it forecasts what air quality is going to be throughout the Southeast. You can dial in on a particular state. You can look at a time slider. It's got a smoke layer available. And if you wanted a more synoptic or broad range look at what's going on weather-wise across the region, you could zoom out. So I actually took this during Hurricane Debbie because I thought it was interesting that you can actually see by the surface wind pattern what's going on right here. You can see this is the hazard mapping system smoke layer. That's where smoke's coming from. So if it weren't for a hurricane, it would actually be a pretty good burn day because we don't have any smoke going on around us. It's actually all been directed, and you can really see the Canadian wildfire smoke, how those winds are pulling it. So that's one website you can look at. And another thing that might help you plan your burns better is the Prescribed Burn Planner. So this is another web mapping application that we just got a grant at Tall Timbers. I literally have the kickoff meeting next week for it to make some updates to this. So it is currently open right now. So it was originally created with the Southern Group of Foresters and a company called the Timmins Group. And you could sign up for it, and there's a tutorial. It says it's only open to select people, but anyone can get in at this current time. And what's nice about it is that you can go in and you can select a map, your burn map, and you could select the point, the location where you want to burn. So you could put all your property in here. You could say how many acres it is, rank it whether it's an active or an inactive on your list and your priority. And then it'll populate the weather conditions for you. So you can see out going the next week what the weather is going to look like for all these fire weather variables, such as the temperature, wind speed, direction, transport wind speed, dispersion index is on there as well. So this is pulling in the same data that came from like the fire weather dashboard that I was showing earlier. But what's also a nice added feature is you can click this update conditions and that you can put in the conditions you want. So where do you prefer to burn? What wind speeds do you prefer to burn under? What transport wind speeds do you prefer to burn under? And then go back and it'll highlight those days. So where most of your criteria are met are going to be highlighted in green. And where the ones are kind of, you know, a marginal burn day are going to be in yellow and bad ones are going to be in red. But I will caution you to also just don't look at the colors and take a look at what's not being met. Because for example, this is from back in September, so it looks like these 3 days are going to be really great. But if you look at precipitation, you're supposed to get 2 to 4 inches of rain. So probably not, you don't want to actually burn on those particular days. But what's nice is you can load in all your property and then you could tell, this is the dashboard view, you could tell at a quick glance, maybe what's going to be good for burning today, what's not going to be good for burning, and what you might want to save for later in the week. And as I mentioned, we just got a grant to update this. So we're going to be including a smoke model with it. So in addition to these fire weather variables, you're going to be able to see where your smoke's going to go. So if you have a lot of good burn days, you can pick the one where the smoke's going to be the least problematic. So instead of just burning the next available day, you might see, oh, a couple of days in the week, it's going to be burning out to the ocean. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Part of the grant is also to make it mobilely accessible, so it'll work better on your cell phone. And then have these enhanced features with it, where it's going to be able to track your burns and tie directly into some databases. So I realized that was a lot of information, but if you have any questions, here's my contact information. You could just Google me, the smoke science at Tall Timbers, and it should pop up. But yeah, and with that, I can take some questions.
Prescribed burn planner, it'll also be.
Yes, yeah. The prescribed burn planner will also send out an email. So if you don't want to check your app every day, it'll send you an email when your conditions are met.
Can you upload a shapefile or can out to that prescribed burn planner?
I don't think that's currently in the grant, but right now it's just a point location. But that we're definitely looking at continuing this on in the future, and that's a functionality that we can look at, including. The question was if we can upload a particular shape file into the prescribed burn planner.
That was kind of my question, but the follow-up then is, so it's just a point with like it's assuming it's a circular acreage.
Yeah, it's assuming it's a circular acreage.
And you can't, did I see, can you draw in a polygon or no?
I don't think so. I don't think it's
No.
currently, no, it's just a dot. It's not currently optimized for that.
It's kind of a scenario, so it might be a little long.
Okay.
Polygon manages Peninsula, St. Johns County, and St. Johns County. At the end of that peninsula, the smoke sensor, like a national smoke. The only way that we can burn is to cross that sensor. What should he do?
So the question is, if you burn a piece of property and your only option is to go over a smoke sensor, what should you do?
Don't do it.
Don't,
It's not like, it's beautiful. Sandhill, not unlike the stuff that Ray was showing. So it's.
Well,
You can't not. You know this.
Sexual or bit.
Yeah, but yeah, like, Jim was, they're mostly concerned with populated areas. So, I mean,
In between populated areas. It's like,
Yeah.
there's condos on Burnham.
yeah, I mean, some of these situations you're just not gonna be able to avoid, but since it's an annual average, the hope is that just a few days shouldn't sink it.
We usually do, because there's so much population, we try and be done by the 2 o'clock.
Yeah, so night settling is a big thing, because if you look at the daily exceedances, which is 35 micrograms per meter cubed, a lot of those are happening overnight. So if you can clear it out, but like I said, if you've got, I mean, you're not burning months at a time. So
No,
if you
yeah.
just have a burn once or twice and you get a couple of high days, looking at annuals designed to kind of gloss
Escape
over that.
Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Thank you.
Going back to that graphic of the circle from Albany. Let's say they're burning, and they hit that annual average or exceed it. Does that mean, at least in George's case, are they just gonna no longer issue authorization in that area for the rest of the calendar year, or?
That has not been discussed, but that, I don't think that would be something they're not wanting to do that. So with the previous pilot program, it just looked at transport wind direction. No, it just looked at transport wind speed. It didn't look at direction, and they still were right at that 9. I think last year was like 9.2 or 9.3 micrograms per meter cubed. So the hope is that this will keep it from there, but there's been no discussion of just once that limit's hit for the year, just being like, okay, everybody's done. They very much don't want that to happen.
Well, thank you, Holly. That was
Thanks.
great.